the dice, man. A ball's on the line, man. Do you take a chance, baby?
This year saw the death of one of the most influential outsider figures in British music, the uncategorizable Mark E. Smith.
He was a true genius because it was not like you can educate someone to be like that. His life was completely about this, about creating his art, and he never compromised.
He was an artistic figure, a really strange, eccentric, wonderful, literary figure, genuinely transgressive.
You could write about anything. I suppose it was a bit like a rap, but a white guy from Salford.
Mark Edward Smith was born in 1958 in Salford. He worked as a clerk on the docks before forming The Fall in 1976.
Fall, as onto barbed wire, as in back inspired.
It was called punk, and then it was called post-punk. But Marky Smith and The Fall were never that, really. They happened to be around at the same time, and they happened to be in Manchester when a lot was happening in Manchester.
Spell on the streets, sometimes look better. Don't know where to go. Wallets in the shoulder. We're gonna love. That's Psycho Mafia.
We're not offensive people. The music is offensive to a lot of people, you know, and coming from the north, you've got this inoffensive, cap-touching attitude, which we're trying to break out of.
Manchester in the 1970s was in a state of chronic post-industrial decline.
It was very rough, and all the canals were filled with sunken barges. Factories had shut down, the mills.
First of all, the sky was grey, so grey, leaden grey, oppressive leaden Moscow grey. The buildings were Victorian and red brick, and they were glowering. They were ominous. It seemed to me that there had been atrocities there, and it was grim as fuck.
So he's stuck in godforsaken Prestwich, you know, the outer limits of Manchester, and he wants to be somewhere. Now, the great artist will make that somewhere themselves. Essentially what it was about was more the love of what he could do with words and how the words helped him construct his reality.
He used a technique which I now call automatic writing, where he sat down and just let it go. And he also used cut-ups all the time.
In the same way that Anthony Burgess could write A Clockwork Orange out of Manchester. You know, Marky Smith was writing stuff that wasn't really about being where he was, but inevitably was influenced by where he was, because it had given him his tongue, it had given him his arrogance, it had given him his weird, twisted confidence.
I think it's really important that The Fall exists, and that's always been my viewpoint on it. I think it'd be a sad day when The Fall packed up. I'm a bit sort of bloody-minded about it. I mean, when I was a teenager, I always thought accessibility was something to be spat upon anyway, you know.
She'll feel the wrath of my bombast.
This was scary and ugly music. It was hypnotic, mesmeric, cacophonous, brutal in places, beautiful in places. He was on fucking fire, and he was on fire for a long time, and you hear it in his vocals. Before he turned into a drunk, his vocals had such intention. They were delivering with such power. He was totally wired. He just liked to make trouble. He was a mischief maker, and he liked to cause chaos.
Over a 40-year career, The Fall released 32 studio albums. 50 musicians passed through the band, but Marquis Smith remained the only constant, hiring and firing like a football manager.
Being in The Fall was like being in a war zone at all times, because you never know which way Mark was going to go and what mood he was going to be in, or how the drugs or drink were going to affect him.
He always took speed, Mark. We all did, to be honest, apart from Bricks. I don't think she liked it. But yeah, I'd say that, that fueled his songwriting a lot of the time, and his observations.
Mr. Pharmacist,
He'd get his carrier bag out with his megaphone and his lyrics, and there would be a bottle of whiskey there, which he would start laying into. This is at 10 in the morning, possibly. So it wasn't always good.
He was becoming irrational and violent and mean. Mark would come back from the pub and just wreck everything we did.
No, I'm not ashamed. I like a beer. I don't think there's anything fucking... I think the worst thing is when people drink under the table, to be quite frank. Nothing worse than a secret drinker.
Bricks divorced Mark and returned to California before rejoining the band in 1994.
When I got back, I was horrified when I saw him. He had aged decades. He'd aged decades in 4 years. Life had taken a brutal toll on him. His face looked like a road map, gouged, haggard. He was losing his hair. He'd lost his teeth. He'd become epileptic. Speed as a drug gives people amphetamine psychosis. I believe that the connecting wires inside his brain were frayed and rotted.
Despite his prodigious intake of booze and speed, Marquis Smith followed his singular creative path with The Fall for another 20 years, producing moments of brilliance. Towards the end of his life, he was performing on stage in a wheelchair.
The funny thing about Marquis Smith, he was one of the great divas. You've got Barbara Streisand, Mariah Carey, Marquis Smith. He was a diva, a vicious diva.
Well, he was just awkward to the very end. So he was against all that, showbiz, pop star stuff.
He was unbelievably loyal and faithful to staying true to himself, which sounds like static, but by constantly moving. And he ages and he changes, but it was always Marquis Smith.
He loved those wild characters like Jerry Lee Lewis, for instance. Hellraisers. I think he wanted to be one of those kind of artists, which he was.
Mark E. Smith died of lung and liver cancer at the age of 60.
He wasn't really a musician because he wasn't structuring it like a musical life. His songs were like the latest installments in the tale of the true adventures of who he was. So he was just living something. So there's no real category for it. You can't actually say it was a poet or a musician or a singer or a performer, although it was all of that. It was just him being alive, and sometimes that meant wandering on a stage.
Last week, after a dinner stew, I had crow's feet under my eyes. Paid 2 days for getting high.
Mark was underappreciated. He did not get the credit that he deserved when he was alive, but now in his death he is. He was one of the greatest, most original creators to come out of Britain, ever.
Freezing, wheezing, got pasted in a bar.
But I kind of think of him as a historian as well, of a historian of the moment, of the moments he was alive. That kind of strange period between the 50s and now that he lived through. If you want to get a history of England, a history of all sorts of conflicts and strangeness and bitterness and daytime television and trivia, Marquis Smith's going to be one of the best places to go for it. It'll take a bit of work, but I would definitely go into it to find out a certain sense of what it was like to be alive these last 50 years.
These are your biggest times.